what I love about their approach is it's so like normal.
Mm. Yeah.
As in, this is what it says. Living a spirit-filled life without being weird.
Exactly. Welcome to Everyday Prophetic, a series where we talk to people about how they hear from God and use their prophetic gift in normal, everyday situations. Today, I am talking to Rev Jon, who is an Anglican priest from Geelong, Australia. So for our international viewers, go to Melbourne and chuck a left, head west for a little bit, and you'll find him. I love John. He's a great friend. We actually have never been in Australia together. We met on a ministry trip to Vietnam and then to Indonesia, and we had a great time. And he's an avid surfer, amongst other things, and he is in this journey of hearing from God. So welcome, John. I'm so glad you're here.
That's a fantastic welcome. And what I loved about that welcome, Teresa, was hearing your very Australian way of saying Australia. Australia.
I haven't lost my accent, I hope.
It's just, do you remember how to spell that? It's Australia, Australia. All right, so where do we go now? What happens then?
Basically, I want to hear about how you hear from God. Like, when did you first start to hear from God? How do you typically hear from God?
Look, I want to share what happened to me when I was 19. I don't know if I told you this story, Teresa, when we were away, but I was a 19-year-old and finished school, and I was working in a national park right on the southernmost tip of the mainland of Australia, a place called Wilson's Prom. It's an absolutely beautiful part of Australia. And anyway, I had broken away from my peer group, who were a surfy crew, but who were also heavy drug users, like heavy marijuana. And I was pleased that I'd got away from Melbourne and there, but they'd come down to visit me the first weekend, and I could see it was just the same deal, and I really didn't have a strength inside me to be able to say no. And it was so that peer thing was I found difficult. And anyway, they left, and I just knew something inside me just said, well, you're just going to have to pull your socks up, mate, and get on with life. And that night I was driving out of the national park. It's about a half-hour drive to watch a movie with some friends. And about halfway out, 3 words came into my head that said, I'm with you.
Wow.
But that came from nowhere. It just, those words, and I had a great sense that I was going to be okay, and because I was pretty certain I was losing my mind, actually. I was pretty lost. And but also I had a sense that voice who my mother sort of believed in and belonged to, my uncle who was an Anglican minister, and my grandmother, all strong faith people, Christian faith people, Christians. And so I got home about 2 weeks later and back to Melbourne, and the only way that I could really express what had happened to my mother was by saying, Mum, I'm religious. And so that, I'd encountered God. As much as I knew that, because I knew that God was really important to them, and that's how I understood it. I had to later on get involved in a church to sort of understand what that faith was about. That Jesus. I really hadn't read the Bible, and I always thought I should do that. So there was a very concrete way And it wasn't like, I'm with you, like, a voice. It was just as clear as a bell in my head.
Wow.
And that turned my life totally around. Now, so I get to the church and, I'm learning, I'm hearing this sort of story of the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. I just got so excited about the early church. But there was never much talk about sort of that, God, there was a lot of ideas, but not much talk about that God was real like that. Every now and then you'd have a missionary visit the church or someone who tells some interesting stuff, or you'd read books like Run Baby Run by Nicky Cruz, or, where God sort of seems so real, So that sort of kept you going. But I always knew that it was possible that God could really speak. So I probably got more encouraged. I attended a YWAM course in Scotland, and that in the mid-'80s, and that helped. And then I tried sort of getting involved with the charismatic sort of scene back in Melbourne, but I ended up in a church community that had kind of been a bit burnt by that. So they sort of pushed away from it. That kind of had sort of been a bit dormant until catching up with Ian Lambert, with Bishop Ian, who we went to Vietnam with. And I met him at a retreat, and I was talking about the Anglican Church and how there's this group, there's the evangelical group, there's the more liberal group, there's the strong reformed group, all these things. And then Ian's response was, then you got the crazy charismatics like me. and so that encouraged me. And then a little bit involvement with Soma, and then to the trip. And so, that's that expectation that God will speak I've continued to be open to that and to try and nurture that, because and to nurture that in the church community where we are.
Yeah.
Just the other week, we had instead of communion service, we had a morning prayer service and opened it up for a time for prayer, a ministry time, which is, I am so delighted that in the Anglican prayer book, it creates a space for that, for the laying on of hands. I'll just read it to you, because I think it's let any who needs the comfort and strength of God's grace come forward for the ministry of the laying on of hands. And so I've taken that, and we've created a space, and that's scary, because you think, gee, what if nothing happens? And I think I've had to learn to say, big deal.
Yeah.
It's what God wants to do.
That's right.
And what we found the 2 Sundays ago, I had people came out for prayer with real issues going on in their life, and we've been able to follow that up pastorally. But prior to the service, I saw a couple of those people, and they kind of smiled and said, "G'day," and you would never know. But in the context of the worship and in what had been shared in the sermons, they'd felt and they needed to respond. And so when we're praying with them, it's not like you've got sort of the answers or anything. It's just whatever you sense God's saying, you speak that.
Yeah.
And trust that,
Yes.
And sometimes it's pretty ordinary.
But the love of God isn't ordinary. It's life-changing.
Exactly, but it can seem like a very ordinary word.
Yeah.
But it's for them. And so it's a beautiful part of the ministry of the church. And I can see that we need to recover that in our life as the church. We're not just a lovely sort of group of people who just happen to be a bit religious, but actually the Spirit of God is in our midst.
Mm.
And so we have to be listening. We have to be listening.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting. You said when you make space for the laying on of hands, the fear is, what if nothing happens? I would suggest the fear could be, what if everything happens? What if God shows up in power and disrupts?
Well, that would certainly, like be a cat amongst the pigeons. but we'd have to deal with that. But I look, I probably might regret my words, but I hope something like that happens, because we want to break that nut.
Mm.
Because I think, as I was saying to a group this morning, there's going to be heaps of people in our community who are very broken people, who have no idea that the gospel has that reality to it.
Mm. Yeah.
And I think in the church it's the same. We're just, we need to recover it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think there's a difference between knowing that there's a God and actually having an experience of God. And from your testimony of, as a 19-year-old, hearing God speak, I mean, you didn't have much theology, you didn't have any theology for that, but you knew in that moment God is real. And I just think
I still reflect on that, and I still, especially when you feel a bit in despair, that, or hopeless or whatever, I remind myself, wait a minute, God is there.
Yeah.
That wholeness. So, I think it's not just here, it's our relationship with God that allows that stuff to happen.
Mm.
It's not just a supernatural trick. It comes out of that ministry, and I think that's what I'm learning.
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of thinking about the, walking with Jesus, having that relationship, that intimacy with him every day. It's not all hearing the voice of God in those grand moments. How do you hear on a personal level? How do you hear from God? I know you love getting into the surf. Is that a place where you connect with God?
As far as God sort of speaking to me in that space, look, it's purely hedonistic, Teresa. It's the pleasure. It's wonderful pleasure, and I think God is really happy.
Yeah.
That that the enjoyment of that. We're at the moment, Teresa. We've been working towards a building project at Hamlin Heights, and it's getting to the point in now where we have to make that decision to go for it. But we have to achieve that, we really need to increase our giving by 30%.
Wow.
Now we're mostly older, retired people.
Yes.
And but there's a real desire to go ahead because the area is growing so much, and we want to have a facility that can really help ministry work. But I can sense in myself that kind of that stepping out of the boat stuff, and have always felt that that's the way to go. I mean, you've got to sort of it is risky.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's good to sort of have that sort of, it calls forth that sort of effort from people. But hearing, so 100%, I've never had that either.
Right.
With anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Getting married, going to work in Gippsland, it's in chaplaincy. It's that sense that you believe it's right.
Yes. Yeah.
I believe it, and it kind of makes sense. And there's been times where it's sort of like the horizon's open that way, but it's really limited that way. And so that's the one that you sense that sort of call coming. Even, the thing to sort of go into sort of a Christian role, it was like the tide had sort of come out from the other, and it was dry, like, this just doesn't feel sort of where I'm meant to be anymore. Not that you don't have dry spots in what you're doing, but it was a vocational thing. And so that's sort of nearly sort of 11 or 12 years now, and it's where that sense of fulfillment is.
Yeah.
So, am I hearing God's voice? It sometimes sounds like a very faint whisper, but that's what sort of calls me forth. It calls you to sort of go on, and maybe it's kind of there's a bit of wishing's not the right word, but it's where you see some hope, and it's a bit of a mystery.
It is. It is certainly. I mean, he's a mysterious God. He's a supernatural God. Yeah. But I think, when we are talking about hearing God, and it does require obedience, and obedience, I think, requires faith. So we hear a whisper, we discern, I believe that's God. I believe I'm in God's will, so I am going to take that step of faith. I think, I guess I'm potentially jealous of those people who have that absolute conviction, like the Lord told me 100%, I have to do this. It's like, that's wonderful. But I think the reality is, for most of us in our everyday life, it is that kind of faint nudging, or as you say, I love that picture of the tide going out, which suggests, it's time to move or transition into something else. Well,
yeah, where I was, I had a fantastic teaching job, teaching phys ed in this lovely Christian school, and if you wanted a really good job, that was it for someone like myself. But it felt empty, and I just it meant a change, and it's sort of probably what had to happen. I just an instance last year was this is sort of a hearing from God story.
Yeah.
So, I'm praying for my kids. I try and remember to pray for them every day, our 3 children. And at one point, I've sort of sensed God saying, you're praying for your kids, but what are you praying for them? Specifically, what are you praying? So don't just say their names.
Yeah.
What do you wanting to happen? And it was so that stopped me, and just sort of parroting off their names. But I had to think, oh gee, okay, what is it that I would? Now you could say, look, that's just your own mind working those things out and talking to yourself. You could say that, but But it often comes in a way that you're not struggling to. It just pops in there.
Yeah, and I think that's what people who are first trying to learn to hear from God maybe don't realize, that it's less of the "this is God calling," and it's more of that, is that my thought or is that God's thought? And I as you learn the character of God, you go, well, is that a loving thing to do? Is that a caring thing to do? That's probably God. Is that a scary thing to do? That can also be God too.
So in our worship, I've tried to also be listening there, because sometimes, I don't know, it might be something in a song, it might be something in a prayer, it might be something in the text, but let's just stop and think about that for it. Let's just be quiet for a moment. And trying to listen, it makes the worship time much more kind of in the moment.
Yeah.
And it brings life there too.
it's when we're actually still for a moment, when we actually create a pause. I mean, isn't it funny that even in church, we can miss what God wants to do because we're so busy serving him, and we have to worship him, and we have to pray to him, and we have to take communion, and he's saying, hang on, kids, just slow it down. I actually want to do something in this moment. And I think that's such an important key.
And I'm trying to learn to just depend on that lead of the Spirit. And if there is nothing there, you've got no sense of what to say. Well, I'll just be quiet.
Yeah.
That's. I think that book I was talking about yesterday, the Everyday Supernatural. He uses examples in there like ministry time. It's like standing on a diving board and the pool is empty.
Wow, that's a good illustration.
and you're going to dive off, trusting that it's going to be full, and
that's great.
But I love it because it makes it possible for anyone. Yeah. It's not about the Spiro person. It's about trusting the lead of the Spirit, and as Christians, that's there for all of us.
Exactly. Absolutely. And just to translate, Spiro means like spiritual person, right? So you've shared some great stories, some sort of really everyday simple ones and some major life-changing ones. If you had one piece of encouragement that you would give somebody who's trying to hear from God or to develop their prophetic gift, what would be your advice?
I wrote down this answer.
Okay. Good. A+.
What would you, this was a question about what would you most like to tell others?
Yes.
Well, the answer I put there was, if our Christian faith is just about sort of ideas or what we believe, rather than an actual genuine encounter with God, then I think we're missing out. And I don't think our world will be very interesting. Because people have got ideas, people have got sort of academia. Nothing against academia. We need to love God with our minds. You can be clever but absolutely impotent. And so, so without that dimension, I think, we're all missing out.
Yeah.
And I cannot see how a Christianity like that will really kind of break into our communities. Yeah. So people need to know that there's some reality there. And I don't know how people are going to achieve that or encounter that without that dimension of the Spirit. So I think they've got to be prepared to have a go.
Yeah.
And try it out. And not. I heard a little YouTube thing this morning from Denzel Washington about it's okay to fail. It's okay to sort of not get it right. It's the little kids learning to walk stumble, and we say, "Well done,"
Yeah.
And I'm sure God would be saying, "Beauty, try it again. Trust me." And try it out.
That's beautiful.
So, not by might, not by power, but by my Spirit. Is that one of those the very last book in the Bible, or close to it, in Zephaniah or something like that? And we've got that banner up in our church, and it's a great reminder to me that it's really it's God who does it.
Yeah.
It's God who does it. It's not, I prepare sermons and things, and I do my best to engage people and have some meat in it. But I could do the very, very best talk ever. But I'd much prefer that God speak to people than it be about what it's not. I can't do it. And I think I learned that in my time up in Gippsland. You've got the church, the Anglican Church up there, it was quite disconnected from the community. Beautiful traditional worship, but the people weren't there. And I thought, how is the church going to make that connection? So I had to trust that, that little mustard seed of life could grow with God's blessing. And, it's hard because you feel powerless.
Yeah.
Weak.
That's how God gets the glory, doesn't it? He uses the weak and foolish things.
Yeah, but, I mean, who wants to be weak? Who wants to be
pressure off? For me, it makes me relaxed because it's like, well, it's not. I'm just called to be obedient. I don't have to do the work. He does the work. I just obey.
For all those listeners out there, see, she's very spiro. But it's not hard. It's not hard. It's not a hard, but that's a good place to get to.
Yeah.
Where you're in that trust place, and I guess we learn that over and over and over.
Yeah.
I certainly do. When you're in a leadership role, you've got absolute limitations, and it's about trusting.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your reflections and your honesty and your stories. I'm so excited for the journey that God is still bringing you on, and the fact that you're bringing your congregation with you. And, I think throughout everything we've been talking about, the one thing that you kept saying that I think really shines through is just that desire to hear him, to have that authentic connection, and not just for yourself, but to break into the community, that the kingdom of God is actually represented, and we begin to take ground for the kingdom.
Teresa, you're listening to me, but you're listening to God at the same time. What's he really saying there, Lord? What's his heart there?
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Rev Jon Taylor, and I'll put the link to your church below for anybody who wants to check you out. If they're in the Hamlin Heights, Geelong neighbourhood, they can catch up with you there.
No worries, and I hope we can connect again and catch up, because it's encouraging to me.
Absolutely.